It's interesting that in the middle of the winter, you can still sometimes find food out here. This is American hazelnut, and there are nuts on it. And oftentimes, I will see these trees completely stripped, even when the nuts are not ripe, even when they're green, by squirrels and chipmunks. And we're in the middle of the forest here in an area that is completely squirrel and chipmunk chipmunk habitat. And so it's kind of a mystery how they would have missed these. I guess there's probably just a period of maximum activity heading into the fall, and then probably pretty minimal after that. So whatever makes it past that bottleneck of foraging probably can stick around for quite a while. I don't know what that means for these seeds, whether they're still viable. I would assume they are, having not been buried and having to deal with some pretty extreme temperature fluctuations. But a couple other things about this that I thought were interesting. So this opening here, this is kind of due south. So the summer sun that we're getting overhead is probably from about noon to 3 or 4. And that's the only direct sun that this bush is getting. And I can see that it had pretty good production last year. It's obviously pretty vigorous. Large bush does obviously produce quite a bit, and it's sometimes hard for me to guess, or it's always hard for me to guess the age of this kind of hazelnut with this amount of suckering, but it's probably 15 years old or something like that. Correct me if I'm wrong, if somebody knows better. But some of these larger stems individually look like they're 4 or 5, and I would imagine that there's a couple larger older stems that are dead. So probably at least 10 years old, maybe up to 15 years old, because it's low light. In higher light, it might look a little bit larger than this. But just kind of interesting to note that this is in total forest context, and I don't see hazelnuts around here very often. It's here because this is a maintained path. So basically just an old logging road, an access road that goes through the forest here. And on the north side of that, we see the hazelnuts. Sometimes on the south side, but not so much. Mostly because they're getting more light from the south. So they're a species that needs more light than a full forest canopy can offer them, obviously, but they don't need full sun to survive and fruit either. So if you have any kind of openings that have, even just that much view of the sky, it seems like they are a good candidate to plant for wildlife and potentially even some human harvesting value. And of course, these are just seedling, well, not just, but they're seedling American. So the nuts are not super large. This is the outer shell, and this is about the size of the actual nut kernel of some of the European varieties. So the inside will look more like a pea size. And so we definitely are interested in getting larger nut size, because even though these taste great, it's a real lot of work to harvest them. And as far as a human food source, it probably won't amount to much until someday when fossil fuel runs out, and then we really have to go for the small potatoes. But up until that point, we still have the wherewithal to do breeding programs and stuff like that. So I do think hybrid hazels have a lot of value. This year I'm going to be growing out a lot of Yamhill and a couple other varieties that I'm trying to get my hands on. So that way we'll have some, blight resistance and size. And for those of you who don't know, the reason that we can't grow Corylus avellana here, which is the larger European hazelnut filbert, is because the eastern filbert blight, which really just takes them out completely. In Oregon, they don't have it for whatever reason, and so they can grow the larger size hazelnuts, whereas out here we just can't do it. So it is good to have those Corylus americana genetics in there, but we do want some larger size. So that's why the Rutgers and other breeding programs, at Mark Shepard and whoever else is working on this project are so important to get this back into a crop that really is so important for human food, for wildlife. There are some estimates that, of course, the pollen data is a little bit confusing, but some estimates in Western Europe that, a mere 500 years ago, half of the deciduous trees were hazelnuts. So it can and should be a really important source of our food and wildlife food. And of course, so many other uses of the wood for building materials, fencing materials, fuel wood, all kinds of things. So really wonderful tree and can deal with a partly forested context. This shows some of the diversity in the wild gene pool. The sun, south is about out this way now. And this is all one individual. This whole thicket is just one large American hazelnut. And it's in much more full sun than the last one. And yet the stems have, half the diameter, maybe most. It's probably a relatively old individual, and it just is crazy about suckering. So, and I have never seen a lot of nuts on this one. In fact, I don't think I've ever found one. I don't know whether that just means that they're taken much more quickly by the wildlife in this area, although I kind of doubt that. But this one just seems much more interested in vegetative growth than it does seed production. So it may have its uses and its values, but not necessarily the kind that we want. And with pure American seedling hazelnuts, this kind of gene is in there. It's not common. I would say out of the wild ones that I see, this genotype is probably less than 5% of the gene pool out here. Most of the time they're 30 to 40 stems in one kind of cluster, and this growth habit is much rarer, but it is in there. But much more of a wildlife value, I think, for this kind of form. For those of you who know what this is, you probably get pretty excited when you see one. This is a praying mantis ootheca, which means it is full of little baby praying mantis eggs. And you can see the one there, and then you can see a constellation of them down there. There's 4. This is a red osier dogwood, and this is one of the actual reasons why I'm most excited about this plant, red osier dogwood. It's good for making baskets, which I don't do, but maybe someday I will. But there's another one. Every single red osier dogwood that I find, almost without exception, has an ootheca or 2 or 5 on it. So for whatever reason, they seem to be prime habitat for the praying mantises to reproduce on. There's lots of other places where you find them. Sometimes they're on rocks and other plants, but for whatever reason, they do seem to be a favorite in my experience. And so that is another major value. And I don't know if they do have any other relationship beyond just laying on them. Maybe there's some pest of the dogwood that the praying mantises like to prey on. I don't know, but I'm curious to find out more if anybody has any information. But great habitat for it. And there are not any berries right now. These are the, that little guy right in front here. I don't know if you can see that. Right here. That's where the fruit was born. They don't taste very good. They're a little bitter, but they are edible. So it is edible berries with probably some interesting nutritional qualities. There's another one with it on there. I passed by a couple willows that had nothing. I was thinking, well, maybe it's because I'm in a relatively open area and there's not a lot of stuff for them to lay on, and they probably want their urticas up above the snow so that they don't stay super moist. So maybe it was the only tall thing out here, but there's a lot of other weed stalks that they weren't on, a couple willows that they weren't on. So there may be some actual preference there. Well, there's one on blue vervain stalk. So not 100% obviously, but it does still seem to be preferential from what I can tell doing really no methodical science whatsoever.